I'm actually representing ADM Capital Foundation based in Hong Kong, but I give all my thanks for support from the team at the Crisis Fund and Save the Elephants and Wildlife Conservation Network all these years. And I'd just like a minute, or not a minute, a moment to remember Esmond Martin, who was murdered earlier in the beginning of last year, just for a few moments, because he was an initial field researcher in wildlife trade.
Thank you, Lucy.
And to move on, yeah, it's just great to see such a support now for the illegal wildlife trade, and Ivory especially.
Hello, I'm Colman O'Creadoin. I'm the Policy Manager with WWF's Wildlife Practice, reporting to Maggie Kennard, who I think is still in the room. Both of us are based in Nairobi. And in my career, I've worked in government in an intergovernmental organisation, the European Commission, and now for the last 11 years with WWF.
Thank you. My name is James Compton. I'm the Senior Director for Asia for Traffic. I've been working in Asia for about 20 years now on wildlife trade, and you make me think back, Lucy, because when I started doing that, the thing that I would most look forward to was the next report from Esmond Bradley Martin, so we do remember him.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us on the panel. And so, as we all know, the force that's driving the poaching and the trafficking that we've been touching on tonight is, in the end, the demand for ivory, mostly based in China still. China's decision to ban the trade at the beginning of 2018 was a momentous moment for elephants, and we saw the price of ivory, the raw wholesale price of ivory, as recorded by Lucy and Esmond in their various publications, plummet from just over $2,000 a kilo in 2014 all the way down to $730 a kilo in 2017. But it didn't fall much further. It sort of plateaued at that level, which was surprising and very disappointing, and it's left us with the knowledge that demand still exists in China, despite the ban, so illegality wasn't the only thing that could extinguish it. So my question to the panel and to all of you here is the burning question of how should the closure of China's legal markets change our approach to demand reduction work? Again, open season for the panel in the initiative.
They've asked me to go first. Yeah, well, I think in your introduction, Frank, you talked about the framing of demand reduction messaging, the death of elephants or the illegality. And I think that because of the policy shift in China, there has been a lot of effort looking at increasing the awareness of a ban that now exists. But if we are to get to the real nub of the issue and the drivers of demand, whether it be people that buy ivory for status or for gifting to others or for investment or even as collectors who just love ivory, we really have to increase the understanding of that consumer and move beyond a blanket messaging that might be looking at a wider public. So by defining those archetypes through evidence-based research and looking at framing that message so it can be delivered from within the culture that we're trying to influence. You have singled out China, so if we are talking about China and the socio-economic, the political context, and really the culture and the language is fundamental. So unless we're thinking, unless we've got Chinese experts working on this, we're going to fail. One other point might be about price data, because I think that it is also important to help triangulate shifts in that market response to whatever we're doing in terms of looking at trying to influence consumers, but also looking at what's available in the market, and a more robust economic analysis, I think, is also going to help us be able to know if we're having an impact or not.
Yeah, thank you, James. Colin.
Yeah, I mean, behaviour change in general is one of the most thankless areas of advertising or marketing to work in. And if we look at the history of campaigns in Europe and North America on, say, smoking, and quite obviously over time that became a moving target. That the problem, first of all, the relative taboo on women smoking melted away, and you got to the stage where more women were smoking than men. But also what was a worrying factor was that people were starting to smoke much younger. And obviously an argument with young people starting to smoke that cancer is just around the corner or heart disease is just around the corner is not going to work. So, you know, you have different sectors, different motivations and so on, and you have to adapt the message. And the consumer sector will change over time. Our work with GlobeScan shows that millennials are a big part of the current buying group at the moment, and for whatever reason, whether it's because they're more free to travel, and we did flash up the report earlier about tourist trade and the Chinese, or maybe they're just more amenable to purchasing Ivory online. Interestingly, I was in Thailand when they were doing the registration exercise for people who were already in possession of Ivory and had to declare it. And they certainly wouldn't qualify as millennials. They were mostly people who were older than I am, which is saying something. And but then again, they probably weren't an active buying market. You know, the market in China, beg your pardon, in Thailand, would have been either in the past Western souvenir buyers and possibly again more recently with Chinese. So. So it is a very complicated picture, and it's different messages for different sectors, and it's not necessarily, any of them aren't necessarily the messages that would persuade the people in this room.
Very good, thank you. Lucy.
Just to add to those comments, I think if we learn from history, in 1990, when the Ivory ban came into effect, the USA and Japan were big markets, and the legislation came into effect, and they more or less stopped buying Ivory as a result. So I think law enforcement is key. Without a ban on its own, without law enforcement, doesn't work. And I think China has done a wonderful job and must be congratulated on their follow-up work in trying to reduce demand through law enforcement and messages whenever Chinese people travel abroad. Come through on their phones to tell them don't buy Ivory, it's illegal to buy Ivory. So the faster method is law enforcement. Changing culture takes time, and that has to be worked from within the country. It's not really up to us to say whether something is good or bad. That's a very cultural issue for the Chinese. But I think law enforcement is the quick one, and looking at social media and internet, which is a growing issue that has to be really concentrated on by those involved in enforcement.
Thank you. Any responses from our active, wide-eyed audience? Ian again.
Thank you. The changing attitude to Ivory we want to engender is that instead of being a status symbol, it is a symbol of shame. Now, perhaps one of the most powerful tools for helping to shape people's emotions is to let them share that through a drama. And I wonder if anyone has tried contacting the scriptwriters of the best soap operas and dramas, so that those characters are embarrassed socially on screen by having received a gift or bought something, and they're showing this, oh my, and you flash through their mind. So they're demonstrating shame rather than pride, and the audience will I think, resonate with that. Again, can we get to the scriptwriters of the best soap operas? In the UK, it's very seldom that conservation ever gets into the subject, and yet they're the drama which much of the population watch to sort of share emotional moments and plot lines. But I think it's an untapped tool.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, sort of inverse product placement. I think the leading example is The Archers, isn't it? The long-running radio show about farming and design as a public service. We were approached by an organisation once seeking vast amounts of funding to start a TV series with that in mind, but your approach is much more sensible, which is to find a program that's already successful and then convince the scriptwriters to... Yeah, exactly. Yes?
Yes, I am the least knowledgeable person in this room, even worse, I am a journalist, a local journalist. Still, I was intrigued by what the WWF gentleman and expert said, because on the one hand, I find very convincing your type of analysis from the conceptual point of view, and the best evidence and vindication of what you said is the history of prohibition. But still, there is a big difference between tobacco and alcohol, where I am the only victim of my excesses, and the campaign against fur, you said fur, yeah, and vegan, which suddenly bring unexpected results. So I am not sure that the primitive approach to this issue, like naming and shaming, would be unsuccessful and illegitimate. For instance, we saw a picture of two charming Chinese ladies wearing ivory jewelry. Would naming and shaming on social networks be effective? Could WWF say, these are two splendid specimens of idiots wearing ivory? This is a question, and I expect a reply.
Si vous voulez, je peux répondre en français, mais peut-être non. I think, first of all, one thing to remember, and we have touched on it, is the tradition of gifting in Chinese culture. That more often than not, when people buy these items that are considered as status symbols, they buy them for somebody else. And I think back to my home country and the illicit product known as poaching, which is basically illicit whiskey. Now, a good bottle of poaching that you have sourced from a reliable supplier is some of the best whiskey you can get anywhere. And if it's from a reliable supplier, it won't make you go blind like some of the unreliable ones will. And in the previous generation to mine, to take the trouble to source a bottle like that and to give it to a friend was really a sign that you had gone to some trouble and you were really thinking of that friend. So shaming in that situation won't work. I think what can work, though, is showing that there are different ways of giving the person status. And at one stage a few years ago, I did write a short play where there's two people waiting for a shop to open that has a rhino horn in the window, and one of them is there because her father is dying of cancer, and the other is there because he wants to throw a rhino horn party for his friend because he's just been promoted and he wants to celebrate. And in the end, of course, when they compare their situations, he realizes he'll spend his money much better by helping the young woman whose father is dying of cancer. So and that's just a story that I made up. But this is part of the approach, that not so much to shame people, because that can provoke a reaction, as to show that they can achieve this status and this self-esteem in a different way.
Thank you, Coleman. We have one more.
I'm Alejandro Nadal, I'm an economist. Sorry for that. I'd just like to maybe put on the floor a comment, or maybe a question about the relationship between supply and demand. We tend to think of demand reduction as if supply, was a different planet, and we need to remember that suppliers and firms develop markets and therefore develop demand. So it's not only a cultural question, there is a cultural question, of course, but there is also an issue for the analysis of the supply. And you mentioned something about the prices, the analysis that you carried out in China. So clearly the decision of China to close the market, the domestic market, has, I don't know if the word is correct, but dislocated the international, the global ivory market, the way I see it. And so it has created all sorts of new processes, maybe going through Japan, and so there's a big discussion on that. But one of the critical issues that come up here, you say the prices were reduced, but they plateaued at $700 and something. And I think this says much more about the structure of the supply side of the equation. I think this is a clearly very concentrated industry that we're looking at. I think your data on poaching goes in that direction. You know, strong cartels, poaching in critical areas, coming back again to those areas. And I wonder if, you know, we can connect this supply and demand side instead of treating them as totally separate issues. I think we clearly need to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting point, Alejandro. Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple more. We're slightly over time already, but I'm just going to roll with it. Hold on.
Hi, I'm Sarah Eppel. I'm a private consultant now. I'm formerly UK government. I was in DEFRA and I led DEFRA's work on behaviour change, not in this field, but on broader sustainability. The one thing I haven't heard is the importance of understanding people's motivations. So the most important thing is that you understand why people are buying the products, in whichever country you're looking at, and segmenting the market in huge detail. And that's not necessarily then leading to a message, actually, because often messages will be completely lost with some of those people. Some people, as Lucy said, just need law enforcement. Others, maybe a message would work, but it's got to be incredibly focused. And for many others, it's not that at all. It's a cultural change. So it's really complicated, and you really have to understand motivations to make any difference.
Thank you. And obviously the problem there with China's scale is that, you know, to survey and get an accurate idea of what is going on is beyond the reach of conservation. We need to talk after in that case. But yeah, we urgently need to find out more detail about what's happening with the demand. We had one more question from Tom.
I think we like to look at this as some kind of linear, you know, trajectory that we reach a certain place and people turn away from ivory. But I think that in my life experience, we keep going in circles. And those circles seem to be related to these massive expansions of middle class in countries that are wildly economic successful. And I started off in the 1980s, which was the, you know, that was the decade for Japan, and Japan was driving the ivory trade, and more ivory was going into Japan than any place else in the world. Japan now is in a different sort of economic trajectory, and we're in China. And China has seen the greatest expansion of the middle class in any of our lives' history. And that market is probably 10, 12 times greater than anything we experienced in Japan. And I think we're going to be in this space, you add in Vietnam, you add in some of these other places, for a long time. And so I think demand reduction really needs to be focused, as you said, very culturally sensitive. We find out that a lot of our messaging, like this is rare, this is endangered, but in certain places, owning that gives you more status. And so, but all that, I think all of you know, and that's the space we're in now, but projecting into the future, where will we be in this demand reduction and ivory trade? And I'm thinking, and I'm an old man, so don't take my word for it, but people say that half of all human population growth on Earth in the next 20 years is going to be in Africa. And I look at Africa that I first moved to in the 1990 basically, and I look at it now and I just keep seeing these huge concentrations of people into urban areas. There's a whole move from rural to urban, and I'm seeing just massive black middle classes and economic elites in these places. And I wonder, because there is a cultural affinity towards elephants, if the next future iteration, you know, COP22 or something, is we're not talking about demand reduction for ivory in Africa, just simply because of what the economic growth is going to be and who are going to be the buyers and where are the elephants. Thank you.
Domi is muttering that it will not be there. A couple of minutes left, but we're just going to take a question.
Well, I'm kind of backing up a little bit because I was going to talk about the demand around Asia and Southeast Asia and China, because I've been living and working around there for about 13 years. And there's a lot of different markets, right? And what I noticed around the borders of, say, Laos and Burma and Thailand and the edge of China and Mongla area, that you have a lot of tourists coming in and they want to have these elephant experiences. And after the elephant experience, they're looking for something to take home. And they're buying these little elephant jewelry, elephant trinkets, and a lot of them don't even know it's ivory. And I interviewed a lot of these people. I questioned a lot of them, Chinese and Westerners. They were primarily, I'd say, about 70% Chinese and about 30% Westerners. Most of them didn't even know they were buying ivory. When they did know it was ivory, they had no idea it was coming from a dead animal. And half the time, even if they knew, they would still buy it anyway. So it was really interesting. These are things that, range from $10 a piece to $300 for bangles and things like that. And this is stuff that's wearable across the border. So you have people that just buy the necklaces, buy the jewelry, buy everything. They just walk right across the border back into China. So it's I don't know. And I see it's a very growing market. I mean, if you go to these border markets, they're quite large, and I don't know how that relates to like the big ticket items, the big ivory carvings and things like that. But when you see that many of them, I'll sit in a market and I watch maybe 30, 40 sales in an hour. That adds up, and that's just one shop. Yeah.
Lucy, do you want to, since you've written about this shifting of the demand to countries on the border and the shift to smaller items, do you want to have a quick say on that?
Yes, I think there has been a shift, and there's so many more Chinese now travelling and able to afford to have holidays, and they tend to go to neighbouring countries such as Laos and Vietnam. And Vietnam is our big problem also, because they have been processing ivory very quickly, so we're making bangles and beads, not carving with any skill, but just for the middle classes and mass production. And many people do like to go to these countries now for souvenirs and to bring something back. And it's easy to get still in these regions compared to China. So and Myanmar also, right on the border, is a casino area where Chinese go to gamble because they're not allowed to gamble in China. So that's another area where Chinese people are selling ivory to Chinese who cross over from China. So these areas are now spreading and have to be watched. And I think it's important to looking at demand reduction is also market surveys and to try to understand who are and what is wanted and how to deal with it that way, to get more data and research in those areas.
Right.
Thank you, Lucy.
And sorry, how do you tell whether it's come from a live, Thai elephant or a dead African elephant? You don't know, because the Thais will claim the Thais will claim they harvested from their live elephants, right?
I think there has been
domestic
talking
elephants.
to dealers, basically.
Yeah.
And in my research, there was a lot of material coming out from Thailand when Thailand cut back on its trade. But also ivory coming in, as we know from seizures, mostly through Vietnam and also to a smaller extent through Bangkok, also and via Laos. And around that Golden Triangle area, there's very little law enforcement possible. This is an autonomous region, and it's a dangerous area, and well known for cocaine and not
opium.
Yeah. And drug trade. So it's a very difficult area to monitor, and that's has been a part of the country that's been affected. On the border of southwestern China, not only for ivory, but rhino horn and helmeted hornbill, and all these items are together. So we have to think about it in that respect as well. To work together on these species in trade, illicit trade.
Thank you, Lucy. Well, the other thing you could do to find out is to talk to Sam. So we'll do that. Closing two questions, because I've done a very bad job of emulating our chairman, because we're already 10 minutes late.
I think one thing really important that hasn't been mentioned yet, although Alejandro kind of got to it, is that traffickers and big dealers in Africa are becoming economically very savvy and are able to create new demands. And I think that that's something that we have to pay really close attention to. We saw, for example, rhino horn first being for dagger handles, then an aphrodisiac. See, that doesn't work quickly, and then someone decided that it cures cancer. And that exploits a very vulnerable audience, and the price of rhino horn took off. We saw pangolins. It's involved smallly in medicinal trade in China, and then all of a sudden it solves rheumatoid arthritis, and before we know it, it's all over the place, and other demands as well. I think we're seeing this with the internet, that people are creating a demand there, and I think we need to pay attention to this, because they are like, you know, economists or marketers creating a market, and we have to stay ahead of the curve. The thing I worry most about right now is the elephant skin trade that's going on in Asia, and it's going to come to Africa soon, and who knows what could happen there, because now you're starting to take, you don't need masks anymore to be killed for the trade. So these are things that we need to stay ahead of the curve on, because these guys are very clever, creating fake news, kind of.
Not only fake news, but fake news you have to pay for.
Okay, we're going to have one more provocative question, and then we're going to go to Pat for some closing comments.
Thank you. I do not mean to provoke anyone. I have been attending a number of side events during this CITES conference, and I gradually came to the conclusion, maybe mistakenly, that the incentive, the motivation behind the demand is much closer to the one in the art market and antique market than in the drug and alcohol. Drug and alcohol, you consume it because you want it. The source is infinite. There is no limit to the supply. Here you have a degree of snobism, of social positioning. The fact that it is a rare resource plays an important role, and I think that if the motivation are totally different, then the tools to combat it, the ones cannot be effective for the other.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting observation. It deserves a lot more deep thinking. It also comes back to the comment from Sarah at the back about understanding the motivations of consumers. And I think you've hit upon one particular segment where we are, some of the work that Traffic is doing in China right now is with collection associations and with those who buy antiques, and really trying to understand what motivates them to own, but also how that market operates and what actually contributes to the value of a particular item. So if we think about it as, I think you used the word snobism, so let's just call it the trappings of nobility. If we understand that, then we can then understand how to talk to these existing and prospective buyers, and then work out how to influence their behaviour.
Thank you, James. Pat.
I think we have to recognize also that not only is our populations growing, but of course a substantial percentage of those coming up now are youth. And I think that the question of discussion about demand is a whole different discussion when we are talking about the youth, who don't have the same connections culturally, those who valued these things in such a certain way. I think Sam's point that demand is being created, will be created in a different way, must really be paid attention to, because I think we'll be evaluating an entirely different chain than has been before. But the one thing about youth is that they are particularly impressed by celebrity, by what seems to be the main thing, and I think certainly the work that STE did in demand reduction in China, seeing celebrities saying no to Ivory, had an amazing effect. And the one thing that I think in planning or preparing for the future with this very finite resource that we can clearly see disappearing, because it is that youth who is actually concerned about when we keep saying, well, we must leave something behind for the future. They're asking now, you're mortgaging our future. This is their conversation. And I think we will have to look at what we have seen with demand before is going to be different going forward. That's what it is.
Thank you, Pat. Well, I think we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed for your